Lawrence Krauss, welcome to the Freedom Pack podcast.
Well, it's nice to be with you, at least virtually.
The place I'd love to start is there's a clip, a very famous interview you did on the Stephen Colbert show. I've seen this clip many times pop up on my social media feed, my algorithm. In this appearance on the Colbert Show, you have this little back and forth, a very good spirited back and forth, let's say, with,
Yeah.
with Stephen Colbert, who, puts the argument or asks the question, why are you attacking my God? And you say that you're not attacking his God, but you're saying that there's no need for God. What did you mean by that, and how do you reflect on that conversation now, all these years later?
It was one of the most enjoyable conversations. I should start by saying that, I mean, I love the program. He's fantastic. When that program's gone, but he was great. And, the producers tell you, you're not supposed to make any jokes. He's supposed to make jokes. And I realized when I answered his first question, I made a joke right away. And I thought, oh, no. No. But anyway, it was brilliant. And it actually went longer than it was supposed to. The producers wanted to end a few minutes earlier, but he was having so much fun, and I was. Anyway, having said that, um, and I'm happy I gave him the last word on that, by the way. Um, uh, what I meant by there's no read God is exactly what I said. That, I've been listed as called an atheist and all the rest of the stuff, an anti-theist. But really, like what I like to classify myself as now is an apatheist, because God isn't important in anything I do. And I've been a physicist for over 40 years. I've never heard the word God mentioned in any physics meeting. The bottom line is God is irrelevant for trying to understand the universe. And that's what I mean. You have no need for God to understand everything we see, right back to as far as we can discern, back to the earliest moments of the Big Bang and out to the farthest distances we can see. There's no evidence or need for anything supernatural.
Mm.
And I wrote a whole book about it. My book, that which he interviewed me about in that program, The Universe of Nothing, showed how you could even create a whole universe in principle, um, with 100 billion galaxies, each containing 100 billion stars, without the need for anything supernatural. So that's what I meant by the fact that God's kind of redundant. Now, people invent God to make them feel better, and that's okay, but you don't need it. If you don't need God to feel better, you don't need God.
So a lot of people out there, a lot of religious people, they seem to they'll take a lot of offense to interviews like that, or guests, or people that speak out when asked questions about religion. But what you're saying is you're not out there commenting on God. You're not trying to debunk God. It's just not something you factor into your work to begin with. You've never even you don't bring him up or it up.
Well, I mean, that's what that response says. But I'm sorry, my camera moves around when I move. But anyway, but having said that, I certainly debunk a lot of religious claims.
Hmm.
And if religious people take offense to the statement that God isn't necessary, that's their problem. First of all, let me make that quite clear. They can easily be offended, but that's their problem, and I didn't mean to offend anyone. It's just a statement of fact.
Hmm.
And if statements of fact offend people, that's certainly their problem. But having said that, I certainly, I can you say with equal fervor that most of the claims of the world's great religions, their scriptural claims, are inconsistent with science. So when you read that the Earth was created in 6 days or whatever, so it's that's obviously inconsistent. There are many other things that are inconsistent. So you can't take any of those scriptural books literally. And of course, most people in the modern world, except for probably Islam, take their scriptural books, take them to be allegories at best, and not don't take them literally. They used to, of course, and wars were fought over that sort of stuff. But uh, so I do debunk. I mean, I do think the religious claims of the world's organized religions are largely false when it comes to trying to explain how the universe works. And 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 you can make your own inference as far as whether that implies any of the other claims are false.
Hmm.
I think it's, I will say that I once debated the head of the Creation Museum, who's a biblical literalist. Um, uh, and Ken Ham was his name. And his point, which I liked well, was that he said if, the whole point of the Creation Museum is that every word of the Bible is literally true. And his argument was if part of it isn't true, then why should you believe any of it? And I said to him, absolutely. I agree. Anyway.
Speaking of late night show hosts, then one of my other favorite ones is I think it was Ricky Gervais on another late show. I can't remember the name of the comedian, but they were discussing his atheism, and they were questioning on why he doesn't believe in God. And he said, let's say the figure, I can't remember the figure, but he said there are 10,000 gods.
Yeah.
You don't believe in 9,999. I don't believe in just one more.
Yeah, absolutely. He's used that. He actually also said it in this interview that appeared in the movie The Unbelievers that was made about Richard and me. And yeah, it's a great point that atheists just don't believe in one more God than everyone else. Because religious believers certainly believe in their God, but they don't think the other religions are right. And they're all inconsistent with one another for the most part. And again, one can say, well, the Abrahamic religions all believe in some similar things, but on the whole, they don't believe in the central tenets of the other religion. And they think that they have a monopoly on truth in that sense. And of course, we just say, if you can be an atheist about those other religions, then, it's easy to be an atheist about yours.
On Richard Dawkins, for there to be someone in the space that actively goes out and tries to challenge and debunk the religious narrative, do you think that that is an important thing to have, or do you just believe that everyone should just focus on their own work and proving their point rather than debunking someone else's, or do you think you have to have both?
Well, look, I think we do things for different reasons, and Richard and I've had that conversation. I just want people to think. And I think so does Richard for the most part. Uh, my goal isn't to destroy religion. I think when people do think rationally, that inevitably they'll lose their religious fervor. But I just want people to think and be free to ask questions. And I think sometimes, in order to get people to think, you have to provoke them. And one way to provoke them is to point out the inconsistencies in their own beliefs. I do that in physics classes, nothing to do with God, but if you get people to confront their own misconceptions, it's a good way of getting people to think about things and often remember things. And so I think it takes 1,000 points of light. And if someone overtly attacks religion, sometimes if they're cogent enough, it'll get people to think. Otherwise, sometimes you do it other ways. So I don't think it's a monopoly on trying to do things, but I think our goal is exactly the same. We don't want people to. In fact, again, I think it was a question that was asked of us at the Sydney Opera House. Anyway, do you want people to follow you? How do you get people to follow you? Neither of us want people to follow us that way. We just want people to think and question. And that's the problem for the most part with religions, and to include in that secular religions as well as supernatural religions, is when any idea becomes so sacred that you can't question it. That's when you should begin to worry.
Yeah. That's what I have actually interviewed a few people who have survived cults, and that is pretty similar to the reflection they have on their experience of sort of awakening in their cult environment, funnily enough.
Yeah. I mean, it's, and you see it when people say you can't question, you can't the question gender or sex, you can't discuss it, or then okay, that's when these people have problems.
So branching out from that interview then, one thing in that interview with Stephen Colbert that he struggled with was the idea of nothing. And I think, there are a lot of people, and you look through the comments, a lot of people, echo that. Where do you think that most people get lost, or at what point do you think they start to struggle with that idea? Where's the main sticking point?
Well, I think the main sticking point is they never thought about it seriously in the first place. I know, seriously, because nothing is a really subtle and difficult concept. And when you start to think about it, you realize how subtle it is. And I did too when I wrote that book, because, for many people, when they think of nothing, they just think of empty space, right?
Yeah.
And that's what the Bible defines nothing as, to some extent, infinite void. of emptiness. Didn't say there's no space or no time because they didn't think that far in it. But and so that's okay. But then you realize, well, that's not really nothing because there's space and there's also time and maybe there are laws of physics. So I think the reason people have problems when I talk about nothing because it causes them to realize that what they're, how can I say this in a polite way? Maybe no polite way. But people don't like a definition of nothing that precludes what they're talking, what they'd like to think nothing is. So
Yeah.
if I just say the nothing of the Bible is this, and then that's easy to show that something can come from that. Well, then they say that's not really nothing. They want nothing to be that from which only supernatural things can arise, I think. But it is a subtle concept. So, in my book, I talked about first nothing in space, empty space, then no space, no time, which is really what I'm talking about, how our universe, our space, our time, and everything within it did not exist and it existed. And even saying it that way is not so clear because it implies a time before of which there may not have been. And then there's a question of laws. Did the laws exist? And and that's an interesting question. With the no space, no time, no laws, and could our laws of physics come into existence at the same time as our universe? All of these are interesting questions, but they all mean something slightly different. And so, I think as long as you're clear about what you're talking about, then you can define it. And the other point that's really important, and I did say that with Stephen, is that our definition of words changes. That's called learning. Science does it. So the whole notion of what is nothing, what is empty space, has changed completely. And science tells us that empty space isn't so empty. There's nothing real there, but there are lots of virtual particles, and people don't like that. People don't like when you redefine words, but that's what happens when you discover how the universe works. And you may not like it, but it's just the way it is.
On learning, another thing I'd love to ask you about is you once said in an interview I listened to that teaching kids that the Earth is 6,000 years old is the equivalent to teaching them that the length of America is about 17 feet. You followed that up by saying the purpose of education is not to validate ignorance, but to overcome it. That was over 10 years ago, that video. Do you think that has gotten better or worse?
Well, it's like everything. Some things get better, some things get worse. I think Western religious creationism in the West is, well, we'll see what happens in the current election cycle. But on the whole, the effort to impose that in classrooms has decreased. Partly due to the work a number of people, and I'm one of them, that have done to try and affect that in public school classrooms. Unfortunately, there's another quote of mine, which is the purpose of education is to make you uncomfortable. That has gotten much, unfortunately, that's what I'm more concerned about now. It's true that there's a problem of validating ignorance in the sense that education, again, when it comes to non-religious things, when it comes to secular religious things, you're seeing a lot of educators validating ignorance when it comes to sex, being binary, for example. But the real problem to me is a much bigger concern that people don't want to be uncomfortable. If they're uncomfortable, you shouldn't use words that might offend them, as you point out, or that might, cause them any other kind of discomfort. And that's just so ridiculous. Creating safe spaces for students so they don't hear certain words. That's not what education's for. And that's become so ingrained in many educational systems that I worry about that a lot more.
Yes. So I was in university between 2014 and 2017. Now I'm often told
you look so young. I would figure you still were, but anyway.
Many people have told me, and many academics I've spoken to have told me that university, say 20 years ago, was a completely different environment to where it was probably when I was still in university. That it used to be a place you went to, because you were actively looking for someone to challenge your ideas, and that's not really the case anymore. How have you seen academia change over time throughout your career?
Well, I agree with, I mean, I have seen it now. It's really been in the last 10 years, less or
Hmm.
less, that I've seen the effect more strongly. I, uh, when I was, it's funny, when I started teaching, the students were more conservative than I was. And when I retired, I'd say that in the whole, they're less conservative,
Hmm.
in the sense that, um, yeah, that these ridiculous notions of political correctness and offense um, and victimization and postmodern ideas like everything must be thought of in terms of power struggles and oppression. Uh, that's really impacted. And in England, I did a debate at the Oxford Union. It was an online one a few years ago on the premise. The debate question was everyone is religious, and I took the side of the pro side, by the way.
Wow.
I'm not like several of my atheist colleagues, because I think that, everyone wants to believe certain things. And what I find is that what the people have converted their religious fanaticism to a secular fanaticism, where they want to believe certain things. And one of my partners in that was a woman I didn't know, a young woman I didn't know, was an Oxford student. And she pointed out that the safetyism thing, this concern about students feeling safe intellectually, has produced an atmosphere where people feel much less safe.
Hmm.
The safetyism has ended up making most students feel more uncomfortable, afraid to say things in class, afraid to question. And it really has. I mean, and universities are enforcing this in many ways, these ridiculous notions, the presumption that physics is racist, a priori, systemically racist, ridiculous things like that. I mean, that, at least claims without empirical evidence anyway. Um, and and so you're seeing that certain things just can't be said in class, and professors don't bring up anything for fear that students will complain. Because right now, if they complain, then a professor can lose his job,
Hmm.
his or her job. It's become instead of an open forum for ideas, which is what universities should be all about, it's become a an environment of closeted preferences and political correctness that gets in the way of learning.
There are a lot of academics I've spoken to that share exactly what you've just said there. They share that sentiment. And a lot of them now seem a little discouraged in that there's no way back for academia. Is there a way back?
Well, I've often said, I like that one of my favorite phrases is that if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And and I'm an educator, so I ultimately think education is the way. I mean, the way to improve education is to educate. That means to speak out. Now, I do it outside of academia now. I'm retired, and I also think it's probably the only way you can do this. Um, and and it, I think by speaking out is the way to save it. By pointing out the problems and getting people to think about the issues and fighting everywhere you see affect limitations on free speech, on open questioning and open debate. But it's going to be hard because universities have ingrained bureaucracies called DEI bureaucracies that are basically requiring loyalty oaths from people now who and don't won't hire people who disagree with these things, and require them to actively promote, not just agree, but actively promote some of these things. Now, a lot of people I know who get jobs will just say this stuff, though, lip service. But some fraction of them believe it, and if they become part of the academia and then teach students that, I've seen young generation of students have been brainwashed by some of this nonsense. Well, you can see it in the uh, campus protests regarding Gaza, where kids don't even know where Gaza is or what it is, but are there's no critical thinking going on. But I think I do think professors need to speak out. and it's hard because they're afraid. I wrote an article on ideology and science for the Wall Street Journal, and I had a lot of faculty from around the country write to me, but they all wrote to me under private email addresses, and several of them under pseudonyms because they were worried about their institutions finding out they agreed with me. That sounds like Russia in the Soviet era, or Hungary, and in that period, and so, or East Berlin. Um, and so I think it's hard, it's going to be hard for faculty to do it. Um, but I think if I like to believe that if you educate the public, that they'll have some impact on even on politicians who have bought into a lot of this nonsense.
Another area of academia that seems to be politicized then, I spoke to Dr. Paul Halpern, who wrote a book, I believe it was called the Multiverse Theory, or basically he wasn't talking about trying to persuade anyone into the theory, but more of a study into the history of the idea and how it's been taken on by pop culture shows. And he was telling me that through his experience in academia, that is a subject that is very politicized in the sense that if someone begins to research in or to look into it, that their colleagues around them start to, they start to lose a bit of credit in their eyes, or more people will shun them or won't work with them.
If they look at the multiverse, you're saying, or what?
Yes, yes. So he
No,
was
I don't agree with
suggesting
that.
you don't
I
agree
mean,
with
look,
that.
look, science is faddish, so there are certain areas that are viewed, that have followings and other ones that don't. The good news about science is self-correcting, because if some fringe idea turns out to be right, namely the evidence points in favor of it,
Yeah.
everyone will abandon their old biases. So scientists are biased, but science is a method for overcoming those biases. But I think in lots of areas, it depends on what multiverse you're talking about. The multiverse of cinema is nonsense. Everyone agrees with that.
Yeah.
But multiverses associated with inflation, or even to some extent string theory, are very much in vogue. And I would say, but to counter that, at least when it comes to particle physics and cosmology, the notion that we live in a multiverse, namely a spatially universe with many other spatially disconnected or causally disconnected regions that we'll never be able to see, but that comes naturally out of inflation. I'd say it's the dominant presumption of the community, not the minority one. But I don't. But these things happen. People can be shunned for certain things, I suppose. But I disagree with them about that one.
In your experience then inside academia, have there been any topics that have elicited similar feelings, or do you think there's some topics that do justify someone losing credit within the academic world, or should science be open to exploring every possibility?
Well, look, they should be, but look, everything should be criticized. That's the way science works. It's dialectic. You throw ideas out and you expect harsh criticism if necessary. And the ideas and that's the only way that the good ideas will survive. And if people can't take that, they shouldn't be scientists. There are our own notions that I think are ridiculous, but one has to check them out. I have great respect for the mathematical physicist Roger Penrose, for example. I think some of his ideas are ridiculous, and I've said so to him, and I think even on a podcast. But I don't think he should be forbidden from publishing them if he can show that they're at least internally consistent. But I should have the right to say that they're ridiculous, and if look, if he only had ridiculous ideas, we wouldn't be discussing his name. The point is, he had some things which were profoundly important and affected fields. So I think what happens is that if you promote things that are nonsense, they can hurt you a little bit. But if you're doing good work, then the good work will stand for itself.
We mentioned, the importance of good science communication outside of academia. So for people out there the everyday person like myself, or probably most people listen to this podcast, it's really important for us to have good scientific communicators who can sort of bridge that gap for us. I think for myself in the UK, growing up, the biggest example over here I can think of is someone like Brian Cox, who I think is very, very good at it. I think maybe in America the equivalent would be on that level of fame, like a Neil deGrasse Tyson, possibly.
Or
What do
maybe
you
even me. Anyway, go on.
maybe Lawrence? Many people might consider Lawrence Krauss the
Anyway, just sorry, I shouldn't go so far. That's
what strategies do you think, as a science communicator yourself, what strategies do you think are the most effective in bridging the gap between complex scientific concepts and the general public that might not understand them?
well, look, again, I think it takes all types. Lots of different ways can work. Different things resonate with different people. But ultimately, I think what we need is, what you need to do is understand. I mean, people ask me, how can I explain things that way I do? And I think, well, how did I understand it when I didn't understand it? How did I come to understand it? And just remind yourself of the process instead of assuming, well, if you're very far along, it's hard to remember where you came from. So I think you just have to try and remember where people are grappling with and why. Um, and I like to inject humor, which I think is important too, because it overcomes some of the fear. Um, and so those are my techniques of humor and just trying to think myself of how I would try and understand this if I were coming to it from scratch. And look, I don't think every scientist should be trying to communicate. I think there's some of my colleagues I want to keep away from the public, but I think it's important that some scientists who can communicate do so. And I think we live in a world now where it used to hurt you, and at various times in my career, the fact that I tended to spend some of my time communicating instead of well, or not instead of, I did both, but that that led some people perhaps to take me less seriously. It didn't bother me, but I think nowadays the need to communicate is much more appreciated among scientists, and probably is too much effort to try and communicate, frankly, because again, you end up sometimes muddying the water.
Well, out of all the sort of scientific communicators I've spoken to, the one trait you can see across, I'm thinking back to conversations I've had with Neil deGrasse Tyson, yourself, I think one thing's very obvious for people watching is that a good scientific communicator tends to have good personality, tends to have a lot of personality they bring. And speaking of someone with bags of personality, the dedication in your book, Beyond Star Trek, is in memory of Carl Sagan. That's a man obviously with bags of personality and was obviously one of the most famous scientific communicators of all time.
Yeah, he certainly, created a whole genre. Many people.
What did he
Yeah.
mean to you?
Well, look, I think he was important, and again, the fact that he was a credible scientist who could write and communicate, and still, and well, he did suffer for it. He wasn't, he did, the various accolades he perhaps didn't get because he was a communicator, but he certainly didn't really suffer. He didn't cried all the way to the bank, but I think the fact that he was taken seriously, and the fact that he was respected by the public was really important to me. Probably when I thought of role models, he wasn't the one. By the way, the one who impacted on me more was than Carl Sagan was a British science communicator, Jacob Bronowski. And you're maybe too young to know who he is, but you should look up the was it called The Ascent of Man? And it's one of the most amazing scientific television series I've ever seen. But Carl Sagan's efforts to communicate and also to debunk were very important. And I dedicated the Beyond Star Trek because his last book, A Demon Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark, I think my mind was his best book. It was really important to try and show people, again, by confronting their own misconceptions, how the only way to overcome demons ultimately is to confront them with rationality.
I mentioned Beyond Star Trek there because you famously wrote about the physics of Star Trek and Beyond Star Trek, Alien, all these other very well known franchises in the mainstream.
Oh, by the way, there's Stephen. I just see that.
Oh, amazing!
Make sure he signed for me that night. Anyway, go on. Sorry.
When I mentioned to Neil deGrasse Tyson that one of maybe my favorite ever movie franchise was Star Wars, he proceeded to sort of tell me why he can't bear to watch it. Can you give me any hope into
I like
some
Star
physics
Wars.
in Star Wars?
I don't think of it as science. I know,
No, of
after
course not.
Star Trek came out, there were 50 books that copied it because publishers copied successful books just like they do successful movies. So, and one of them I think was the physics of Star Wars. But of course, these things don't do very well because Star Wars isn't about Star Trek purports to be in some sense about science. Star Wars never does. It's
No.
fantasy and pure fantasy. But it was groundbreaking. I mean, I remember seeing it when it first came out. I didn't know what it was. I remember I accidentally went opening night when it opened the first one, and I'd never seen anything like it. And then I was in graduate school and I saw the other episodes opening night. I always did. So I did after the first three, I lost interest in it, but it became too derivative of itself. But the first three I thought were from a movie making perspective groundbreaking. But the science, I don't. They're not science, and they shouldn't purport to be science, and they are fantasy more than anything else. And a lot of people love fantasy, but you can't, from a science perspective, and that's probably what Neil was talking about. Star Wars can't compare to Star Trek.
Yeah. What is it about Star Trek then that is, closer to the what sort of physics do they try to follow throughout their show? I'm
Well, I
not a
mean,
big
well, I
Star
wrote a
Trek.
whole book about it. You need to read it, but
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
I think the point is that what is wonderful. I think one of the reasons that Star Trek has been so successful is it presents a future, probably an unrealistic one, maybe, but a future where science makes the world better.
Hmm.
Um, and where literally it overcomes the kind of pseudo supernatural and irrational notions that govern humanity, including war and other things. And so it presents a world where science and rationality can make the world a better place. And I think there's so many dystopic futures, including Star Wars in some sense, views where the future is so much worse because of science and technology.
Yeah.
And I like some of them too. I mean, I love, I was just going to say it, the one with Harrison Ford, famous, probably the most famous science fiction movie. Oh my God. Anyway, name will come to me at some point while we're talking. Um, and there are so many, most of them have a dystopic future. And it's nice to see something different. It's also, it presents things that people would love to travel through space. People would love to transport things. All those things are, it hits on things that people really want. And and so I think that's probably one of the reasons why it was so successful.
Amazing. Well, that's one thing I'll take away from this
Blade
conversation. Is I'm
Runner,
gonna
Blade Runner.
Blade Runner. Yes.
Okay, I couldn't think of anything else until I got that. Okay.
A tweet you put out recently really caught my attention. You told the story of sitting in your basement 55 years ago, watching man step foot on the moon. Talk to me about how your views on space exploration have changed and where they are now.
You're hitting all the points, aren't you? Well, look, I really, I mean, it was so inspiring, and that's in my mind the only, the most useful thing about sending humans into space is that it can inspire young kids to get interested in science, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't think sending humans into space is useful. I mean, certainly scientifically, it's not useful at all. The best science is done when it's so much cheaper and so much more effective without humans. Because when you send humans into space, 99.99% of the cost of the mission is to keep humans alive, leaving very little left over for science. And you can only explore places where humans can survive. You can't, explore in Jupiter's under, or at Venus or under the oceans of Europa and Enceladus and so I think we do space exploration for adventure, and I can understand that. I testified before Congress with Buzz Aldrin once on the future of space exploration, and I said that I think as long as we're honest about it and say we're sending these people to space just sort of because it's the final frontier and we want to excite people and it's exploration and adventure, that's fine as long as we don't take the money out of the science budget to do it. And a single human space expedition is more than the entire budget of the National Science Foundation, probably. And if it's an expedition to the moon or somewhere. So I worry when funds are taken, when human space exploration is presented as if it's a boon to science and takes money from science. There's no scientific, and also we can just do things so much better in space without humans. Humans evolved to be pretty well adapted to the environment on Earth. They didn't evolve to be well adapted to space. And moreover, mass is the enemy of space travel. And humans are these sort of 100 kilogram or whatever, 70 kilogram bags of water. It's so much more. It makes no sense to kind of use humans as our tools of exploration. The robots on the rovers on Mars that have been around for decades, humans, they don't require food or companionship or sex or love or anything. They just, I find them very poetic, these lonely things moving on the surface. And they're getting better. And people, and I have friends of mine who are geologists, including one of the geologists that walked on the moon, say that a human geologist could do in an hour what the rovers are doing in 6 months. Okay, but you can send 1,000 rovers to Mars for the cost of sending a single human, and now they're getting better and better. And so I mean these romantic notions about sending humans to Mars, I don't understand it. It's not going to, no matter what Elon Musk says, it's not going to happen soon. People are going to die, and why? And what's the point? Look, in the long run, I accept that in the long run, it's nice for the human species to move out into space and diversify, not put all its eggs in one basket and hedge its bets against destruction. But we're talking millions or billions of years. We're not talking in the decades. And so sending a colony to Mars right now isn't going to help Earth at all. And in fact, it's ridiculous. It's just ludicrous. Better to send them to the ocean floor. It's probably easier to live there than it is in Mars. Anyway.
It does make for a good movie, though, for
Of
my
course it
fellow
does,
Martian fans out there.
Yeah, but I point out you can send a rover to Mars for the cost of sending Matt Damon to Mars in a movie. Okay? We're making a movie about sending Matt Damon to Mars. So really, the rover costs are not that different than making a major Hollywood movie.
Here we are.
Anyway.
There are, for the everyday person, there are so many questions out there that keep people up at night, or so many concepts that keep people up at night, whether that's the origin of the universe or trying to comprehend an ever-expanding one. What is the question, for someone like yourself who understands these things, at a much higher rate than the average day person, obviously, what is the question that keeps Lawrence Krauss up at night, figuratively speaking?
I get asked that a lot. Usually it's something very personal, but the big questions are the ones that, they're to me the obvious questions. But one of the big questions is, and Einstein put it the wrong way. He put it, the big question I'd like to know is whether God had any choice in the creation of the universe. And he said that he didn't mean God, and he didn't mean creation. What he really meant are the laws of physics unique? Is there only one law of physics that can exist? And if you change it, would reality disappear? And that's the big, deepest question, and it relates to the multiverse, and I'd like to know the answer to that. I grew up at a time when thinking the answer was yes, there's only one set of laws of physics, and our goal as scientists is to understand how that arises. And now that's changed because it could be many that are consistent, and our universe could just be an accident. So, are there other universes? Of course, the other question is are we alone? These are not novel questions, but they're. But for me, of course, because I'm intimately tied to it, because I proposed its existence and then it turned out to be right with dark energy, I'd like to know what the energy of empty space is due to, and that's probably the biggest mystery of fundamental physics. And I don't think I'm not hopeful we'll understand it in this century. But it's certainly, since it's the dominant stuff of creation and it determines the future of the universe, it might be nice to understand it. So those are some of those are a few of the things that on a good night, they keep me up at night.
Well, for scientists then, I can only imagine that pursuing and trying to figure out the answers to these questions comes with a lot of meaning, a lot of personal meaning. If you say and this could be a silly question because the answer might just be yes. If we lived in an imaginary world right now where you had the power to sort of click your fingers and you could have the definitive answer to some of the mysteries of the universe, would you? Or is there something beautiful in the pursuit of knowledge and the meaning that gives you?
Well, look, I think the pursuit is generally more interesting than the finding, yeah. But the great thing is that the finding always leads to more questions. So I am quite comfortable not knowing. And I'm quite comfortable not knowing everything. I just want to know a little bit more tomorrow than I knew today. So, and that if that search is infinite, That's wonderful because it's guaranteed job, uh, protection and job security. And if it isn't, if there's an ultimate theory of everything, it probably still won't be there'll still be mysteries, you see. People used to call string theory a theory of everything, which was a real misnomer because it was really a theory of very little. It was really the physics of quantum gravity, while profoundly important from a philosophical perspective, is only relevant at the very beginning of the universe and probably the center of black holes. Everywhere else, quantum gravity doesn't matter. Classical general relativity works. But even if we had a theory of quantum gravity, we still don't understand how oatmeal boils and lots of other things and how many biological systems work. So there's going to be plenty of scientific questions to keep going and going. And so I'm not concerned about having all knowledge. I think it's unlikely that that will ever be the case. And that's great because, as I say, I'm not comfortable not knowing things. I love not knowing things. That's why my last book in England is called the Known Unknowns, because that's what's wonderful. And it's called The Edge of Knowledge in the U.S. And as I often point out, far more interesting than the known unknowns are the unknown unknowns. But that would make a much shorter book.
There's one question that I ask every guest that comes on the show, whether they are a physicist, whether they're a Hollywood actor, whether they're an athlete. I ask the same question.
I'm all of those anyway.
You're all of them in one, so you this could be the best answer of the lot.
No, that may not be the case. Anyway.
No. Right now, for Lawrence Krauss, what makes life worth living?
Absolutely everything. I mean, the fact that I wake up every day and that there are new things to discover, that there are mysteries that remain, that the future is both exciting and terrifying, I think is what makes life worth living. That you don't know what you'll be doing tomorrow. I don't know, and what surprises I'll encounter, and the fact that I can still be surprised every day makes life worth living.
Wow. That's a very good answer, sir. A very good answer.
Good.
Amazing. Well, as we mentioned before we started recording, there may be some people listening who are brand new to some of these ideas and brand new to your work. They may not be familiar with your work up to this point. For everyone, with that being the case, where's the best place you'd recommend we send these people right now to connect with some of your work? Where can they start that journey?
A website, lawrencemkrauss.com, has it's a pretty good comprehensive list of all the books I've written and the articles and the podcast and everything else. The podcast you can and some of the current stuff you can go to the Substack site, Critical Mass, Lawrence Krauss Substack, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And the podcast, of course, you can watch there or on YouTube. And for seeing my current views every now and then, you can follow me on Twitter at lkrauss1. But lawrencemkrauss.com we try and keep up with most of the things I produce.
Amazing. Well, I will leave links to the website, to the Origins podcast, to the Substack, and of course, your Twitter handle below for everyone to go and click and check out and connect with you there. Until then, Lawrence, thank you so much for joining me on the Freedom Pack podcast today. It's been a pleasure to speak to you.
It really has been a pleasure. It was